Clay Regazzoni is one of the most evocative names in Formula One history, synonymous with the golden era, the 1970s. Ferrari's flamboyant, mustachioed superstar of that exciting new slicks and wings Formula One era, he brought colour and character to the Scuderia's driving line in contrast to his icy cool team leaders, Ickx and Lauda. A curate's egg of a racing driver, he escaped more than a few scrapes with danger and disaster, and was never far from a scrap or a spin. But he was also, on his day, somebody who could drive like an angel. Still remembered 3 decades on as one of Ferrari's fans' all-time favourites, Rega had the distinction of being one of the few drivers in Formula One history ever to have been fired and then rehired by that old man of Maranello, Enzo Ferrari himself. He also scored Williams' first ever Formula One win. That was all part of the legend that is Clay Regazzoni. Enzo Ferrari had fought shy of employing Italian racing drivers ever since Lorenzo Bandini had tragically been burnt to death live on the television screens at Monaco in 1967. But Regazzoni, the 1969 European Formula 2 champion, seemed to offer an ideal compromise. Although Swiss, he'd actually been born a few hundred metres over the Italian border. And right from his debut here in Holland in 1970, he proved both confident and quick inside the Formula One Ferrari. As he mastered the slopes of this scenic Dutch circuit, there was little doubt amongst the watching cognoscenti that Clay Regazzoni had instantly announced himself on arrival as being a pucker Formula One driver. The demanding up and down nature of the Brands Hatch circuit seemed to suit Rega's all-out action driving style. He always seemed to do well there and was destined to win the following year's 1971 Race of Champions. As the field hammered past the start-finish line for the first time, Ickx led well for Ferrari, while Clay was nicely placed in a solid 6th position, and Jackie Stewart, the reigning world champion, hard behind him in 7th. As Clay's pit board showed, he was soon up to 5th, indicating that his impressive point scoring at Zandvoort was no mere beginner's luck. Stewart got past him, but Clay had the last laugh and eventually finished 4th. The fast sweeps of the glorious old Österreich ring suited Ferrari's V12 engine perfectly, and the Austrian Grand Prix would prove a real breakthrough for the Scuderia's new Swiss driver. Ickx and Regazzoni proved to be in a class of their own here, even faster than local hero Jochen Rindt, trailing behind them in 3rd place. Rindt's Lotus soon broke, leaving the 2 Ferraris in the clear to win as they pleased. And the thousands of tifosi who had poured over the border from Italy to Austria now had a new hero in Rega, a love affair which would never fade. He also earned the professional respect of his team leader, hard to please and notoriously icy cool Belgian Jackie Ickx. Monza in 1970 was a Grand Prix of mixed emotions for Italian Formula One fans. Jochen Rindt had been killed in qualifying, but the show went on and Ferrari was still centre stage. Il Commendatore unusually was there for this race and inspired Ickx to pole position. Rega was 3rd on the grid but failed to make a brilliant getaway. However, he was soon carving his way back through the field. Jackie Stewart in particular was to make no secret of the fact that he disapproved of Rega's hard-charging approach, sparking a fierce and long-running on-track rivalry between the 2 of them. And it was in this race that it all started. But all Clay cared about was that he was now in the lead, a Ferrari driver in 1st place at the Italian Grand Prix. It doesn't get any better than that. The old chicaneless Monza slipstreamers ensured that the order never stayed the same for long though, and Ferrari team leader Ickx soon reasserted his authority. Passing Peterson's abandoned march, he was now back in front of Stewart again. A lap later and the Ferrari's V12 power got Rega past the Scots March Cosworth once again. This was a thrilling slipstreaming duel that would run and run. By the checker flag though, Regazzoni had broken free, scoring a debut Grand Prix victory which Ferrari drivers could only dream of. As the Scuderia sought to close the 1970 World Constructors' Championship, Clay's performances and point scoring were becoming ever more valuable. Formula One travelled on to Saint-Gervais in Canada. Jackie Stewart was now armed with the first ever Formula One Tyrrell, and he and Clay prepared to resume what was fast developing into a personal battle. Jackie blasted off into the lead and gave a sneak preview of what the rest of the field could expect in 1971, but Regazzoni, as ever, was quick too. By Mexico, at the final round of the 1970 season, Clay was fast enough for his first ever pole position. A clean-cut Regazzoni was now very much Italy's new hero, despite the fact that he carried a White Cross of Switzerland on his crash helmet. That he'd been born only a few hundred metres over the border may have helped him to qualify as an honorary Italian in the fans' eyes. And neither did the fact that he was by now just as quick as his teammate X. Clay's taste for the amazing high-speed bank of the Peraltada corner made it little surprise later in the decade when he'd happily compete at Indianapolis. As he and Stewart renewed hostilities, Jackie was then put out of the race by the most unusual circumstances when he ran into a dog that had somehow strayed onto the circuit, damaging his suspension beyond repair and leaving the way clear for Regazzoni to complete his rookie year in a solid second place to teammate X. That was a suitably impressive conclusion to a debut season in which, one way or another, Clay Regazzoni had made quite an impression. By Spain '72, some 18 months on, Regazzoni was a fully fledged Formula One star, having further impressed Ferrari during 1971. Regazzoni had a completely new car and was third in place as the field completed lap 1. He then took a grandstand seat as Stewart and Emerson diced for the lead, trying his best to keep his occasional teammate Mario Andretti firmly behind him. Fittipaldi eventually broke away, as he'd so often do during 1972, leaving Clay to fend off the advances of his American stablemate. Rumours were already brewing that Regazzoni wouldn't be offered a Ferrari contract for 1973. That seemed crazy to the rest of the paddock, but then Enzo Ferrari's Machiavellian motivations were rarely entirely clear. Why run 3 Ferraris here in Spain, for instance? On this occasion, it would be Regazzoni who had the last laugh though, enjoying his moment of glory up on the podium, having finished in a solid third behind Emerson and X. Clay didn't do his bargaining power much good by breaking his wrist shortly after playing football with his mechanics, and he then returned to action of all places at the Nürburgring. He was soon ahead of both Emerson and Stewart, 1972's pair of world title contenders. Nürburgring expert X led the way at this beautiful but deadly dangerous circuit, and Clay grittily backed him up in second place, ahead of Emerson and Jackie. This was a race which Jackie really needed to win if he was to succeed in defending his world title. But now there was a real needle between him and Regazzoni, and soon it would be like Monza 1970 all over again, as they fought it out for second place behind leader Jackie X. Clay just managing to keep his nose in front. Sticking tight to his exhaust, the frustrated Stewart was trying absolutely everything in his power to get past, and on the very last lap the almost inevitable happened. The cars touched and Jackie was sent crashing into the barrier and out of the race, leaving Rega to complete a Ferrari 1-2. While Jackie was left fuming, Rega maintained that the Scot had nobody but himself to blame, having tried to overtake at an impossible place. On the podium, he seemed to enjoy explaining to his teammate X precisely how he'd managed to ensure that his arch-rival left the Nürburgring empty-handed. By Austria, Stewart was armed with yet another Tyrrell, and it seemed a case of seconds out, round 4. Clay was on the front row for Ferrari once again, and surely that would be enough to keep him his drive for 1973. But then who knew how the Commendatore's mind worked? Not logically seemed to be the answer. Tellingly, Enzo later described Rega as a bon viveur, dancer, playboy, footballer, tennis player, and in his spare time, racing driver. In a role reversal of the Nürburgring, Clay was now hard after Stewart, and the rest of the field were pretty much in a race of their own. Interestingly, in light of future events, Ferrari's number 1, X, was absolutely nowhere. Regazzoni's race was not fated to last for long, though. He chased hard after Stewart, but his car could not take the strain. Lap 13 would prove unlucky for Clay, and into the pits he trailed. A fuel line had broken, but all Rega knew for sure from the driver's seat was that his race was over. Unimpressed by both his breakdown and Ferrari's disinterest over a future contract, Regazzoni was persuaded by BRM's big cheese Louis Stanley to drive for them in 1973 instead. Big Lou's famed powers of persuasion had worked their wonders again, and Clay put the Marlboro-coloured car on pole position for 73's first Grand Prix in Argentina. By the time Rega emerged from the pits here in Kyalami, his season was already on the skids. Indeed, this South African Grand Prix would very nearly turn out to be his last. Clay qualified in a fine 5th place, but for reasons that are still unclear, got bogged down badly on the grid and made a dreadful start. These South African spectators must have relished the thought of witnessing yet another hard Regazzoni charge up through the field. In fact, they must have thought themselves in for a rare treat, because as the full field filed through, Clay was flat last, although running well. Instead, what they were about to see was near disaster, an appalling scene sadly typical of 1970s Formula One. Early in the race, these cars, after all, were chock full of petrol, and their fuel tanks ruptured alarmingly easily.
We were into the 3rd lap and I was following Charlton and Royston. Charlton lost it on the first corner and I hit him, and consequently spun and stalled in the middle of the track. Regazzoni came round, hit my car, and the whole lot burst into flames and we disappeared off to the edge of the track, all in flames. And I pressed my fire extinguisher, put my fire out, got out of my car and looked across, and Rega was unconscious in the car. So I went over and undid his seatbelts, tried to pull him out, and I couldn't get him out because his legs were trapped by the car, which was squashed up. And then my clothing caught fire because the petrol was leaking out of his tank. And I went away, and then they got the fire out, and he was still sitting in there, unconscious. And then the fire went off again, so I went back in again and helped pull him out with the help of a of a marshal.
When Mike the Bite later visited Rega in hospital, Clay's first words to him were, "Ciao, pompier," hello, Mr. Fireman. But even that accident wasn't enough to put him off. He made his racing return at Montjuic, Barcelona's magnificent Parkland Street circuit. Rega's hands may still have been burned, but he was raring to go and qualified 8th, just 7 weeks after his near-fatal accident. All things considered, it must have given Clay particular pleasure to have started just a couple of spots behind Ickx and well ahead of his replacement as number 2 in the Ferrari team, Italian Arturo Mazzario. Nor would it have escaped his attention that the Scuderia seemed to be struggling badly with a new car design which simply refused to work. BRM teammates Beltoise and Lauda were well placed as Rega set about Ickx, and there could be now little doubt that Clay's recovery was complete. How else otherwise could you fling a 200-mile-an-hour Grand Prix car around a tricky street circuit like this? Sadly though, this wouldn't be a glorious return. Clay's eyes from the cockpit are unamused. All that effort and bravery for nothing. In fact, Regazzoni was already pondering his future for 1974, having rapidly arrived at the conclusion that BRM was a dead end, despite Louis Stanley's promises and all the Marlboro money. Monte Carlo would take his mind off matters for a while, and it was here, allegedly, and almost unbelievably, that Ferrari got back in contact. The old man from Modena apparently having changed his mind. For the moment, however, Rega was otherwise engaged, perhaps living more intensively than ever, after having so recently survived a close encounter with death. And he enjoyed the company of his young Austrian teammate Niki Lauda too. One way or another, this pair would remain colleagues for the next 3.5 years. Lauda looks astonishingly fresh-faced here, although eventually he too would fall foul of these fiery Formula One cars of the 1970s. Clay's hands were still nowhere near healed, and it was a particular handicap around a Monaco circuit, requiring several dozen gear changes per lap, the race of 1,000 corners as it used to be called. Rega shrugged off the pain though. This was all part and parcel of being a 1970s Formula One hero after all. Blank faces at BRM provided a clue as to how well qualifying was going, and although Clay would eventually line up a lowly 8th on the grid, Marlboro's promotion girls seemed to think that that was good enough. Lauda was quicker than Rega in an equal car, a hint of things to come, but intriguingly, in light of what was going on behind the scenes and in the Ferrari garage in particular, Clay here lines up alongside Ickx in the pits, just as they would do later on the grid, and both were well ahead again of Mazzario. As the field blasted away from the grid, Clay made a cracker of a start and was up to 3rd by centre vote. Perhaps he knew, as ever, Il Commentatore would be watching the race live on television from the Ferrari farmhouse. Rega was still ahead of Stewart at Casino Square, and Jackie must have thought that history was repeating itself. Further down the field and on the right, a future British driver, James Hunt, was making his Grand Prix debut. 1973 was the very first year of usage of the new-fangled swimming pool complex, and this is the best view of the lead up to it. Le Rascasse was also brand new that year, a corner that Rega would regularly fall foul of in the future. For the moment though, he grittily hung on to third spot and was soon to lap Mazzario, his replacement at Ferrari. But the BRM kept failing to finish, only 15 laps in, and already Clay's brakes were boiled. Enzo Ferrari's phone calls would soon be returned.
Quindi un uomo di una personalità molto spiccata, un uomo di una vitalità, un uomo che è entrato nella mitologia, quindi un uomo che ha creato dal niente una grossa azienda.
January 1974, and Clay Regazzoni was the driver for the Scuderia once again. Initially, at least, the cars were tricky, and the Swiss was fortunate to have such a brilliant test driver alongside him in the shape of teammate Lauda. But as Clay had recommended him from BRM, perhaps he was entitled to some good fortune. Rega and Lauda were soon to become synonymous with success under the stewardship of their young team manager, 26-year-old Luca de Montezemolo. Clay qualified second here, Nicky eighth, and the race was started by the legendary Juan Manuel Fangio. As the Argentine crowd went wild with excitement for their new hero, Carlos Reutemann, Clay set about the task of lapping an apparently endless stream of back markers. Denny Hulme beat him to the win, but Clay was second, and delighted to be a Ferrari driver again. At a wet Jarama in April, Ferrari's torquey V12 engine was a very handy weapon to have in Spain's spring rain. Ronnie Peterson was fast out of the blocks, but the Ferrari pair were hard behind, with Lauda leading Rega. Clay had been third quickest in dry qualifying here and was always a factor during a wet race. He ended up second as Niki Lauda to win. Montezemolo was delighted. Ferrari had recently switched tyre manufacturers to Goodyear. Clay Regazzoni was obviously pleased with the grip that his new wets had given him. The conditions at Monaco, however, couldn't have been more of a contrast, and Ferrari's recent upswinging form was confirmed when they locked out the front row. Clay qualified second, but got the best getaway from the grid. First lap carnage further down the order saw the track still covered in dust when the leaders came round on lap 2. Reger was in the lead then, but finding it difficult to break away from a chasing pack of 1970s superstars, rounded out here by Scheckter and Hunt. In fact, a wildly overexcited Jarrier seemed Clay's most dangerous opposition. Eventually, however, Regazzoni eased clear. His flamboyant, fluid driving of his Ferrari was such a part of his character inside the cockpit. Unfortunately, so also were a regular series of appointments with the Armco, and Clay would unaccountably throw this race away. Spinning at La Rascasse on lap 20, Reger eventually recovered to finish fourth, but spent over 60 seconds facing the wrong way. That mistake cost him the race. Still, even that was an improvement on his performance from 1972 when he spun off in the rain and on his trudge back to the pits punched a policeman. Il Commentatore might well have fumed at Reger's Monaco error, but inside the Ferrari team, the squad, unlike Enzo, actually travelled to every race. Clay was more popular than ever. He was quick, he was pleasant, and he didn't take himself too seriously. He even managed to make Niki Lauda laugh.
Io voglio I primi 6 classificati. Il tempo più e il meno.
Al 20° giro voi segnate tutti,
anche il mezzo giro. Al
Hey, very important.
Very important. I primi 6 io voglio fare i calcoli della classifica.
Punta a tirare la matita da quelli.
First 6.
Dai la calcolatrice piccolina, quella piccola calcolatrice te la metti là davanti. Fai tic 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 tic. Allora lo vediamo andare forte o andare piano secondo i calcoli che fa, poi sbagli.
But Regazzoni could do the serious stuff too. Initially unhappy with his car here at Zandvoort, he set up the changes from the cockpit which would ultimately see him qualify second to Lauda and lock out yet another Ferrari front row. Just 12 months earlier, Scuderia were in such bad shape that they hadn't even bothered to turn up. So Reger's point had been proved, and despite the odd stray spin, his reputation had been rehabilitated. This would prove to be one of those races where, as in the later era of Schumacher and Barrichello, if you weren't driving a Ferrari, there wasn't much point being on the grid at all. By the start of lap 4, Lauda's lead was almost obscene, reviving memories of Lotus and Clark. Reger's role in these increasingly common situations was to ride shotgun and hold the rest of the field up. Championship leader Emerson Fittipaldi would later fall foul of that tactic at Watkins Glen. Watching Clay's artistry at a tricky track like Zandvoort, it seemed difficult to believe that this was the man who would occasionally, and apparently quite happily, throw his car at a wall on some street circuits. But those contradictions were at the heart of the man and made him uniquely fascinating. An easy second place, just 8 seconds behind Lauda, was his reward here. 1974's French Grand Prix was held for the first time ever at Dijon. The circuit would prove to be a happy hunting ground for Regazzoni, but rather less so for his future foe, James Hunt. Up front it was Lauda, Peterson, Regazzoni. It was clearly a racing driver of some note who could let Reutemann and John Watson inside just 2 corners. Rega seemed at his best around fast sweeping turns, and he'd go on to win here at Dijon in 1975 at the non-championship Swiss Grand Prix, which seemed apt enough. Peterson won, but Nicky and Clay seemed happy in second and third. Chief engineer Mauro Faghieri, along with Montezuma, Lauda and Regazzoni, had transformed Ferrari's fortunes during 1974. And clearly an over-intense looking engineer was fretting during qualifying. It undoubtedly proved to have worked, as the Nürburgring played host to yet another Ferrari front row. Emerson stalled at the start, and by a miracle nobody hit him. But this would prove to be a race full of errors by Formula One's usual front runners. Lauda, madly out of character, crashed within the race's first mile. That left the way for Clay Regazzoni to clean up, simply driving away from the rest of the field on Grand Prix racing ultimate circuit and scoring perhaps his finest ever win. That proud mustachioed grin was what some people called Clay's bandit smile.
Is fourth with 36 and fifth is Peterson with 22. Classement. Après la fin du Réunion, premier Regazzoni, deuxième Scheckter, troisième Reutemann, quatrième Peterson, cinquième
The 74 championship calendar's final 2 Grand Prix were in Canada and America. Clay headed stateside with a chance of a real shot at the world title, with 2 races to go and a 3-point lead over Emerson Fittipaldi. And if Clay looked relaxed at the prospect, and that might have been because whatever happened, this was certainly better than tooling around midfield in a BRM. Fittipaldi versus Regazzoni saw Emerson start on pole and Clay back in 6th, but the race would turn out to be much closer, with Rega making a great getaway and slipping around the outside of Reutemann. Soon he was 3rd and right behind his rival, while the remainder of the field were in a race of their own. Clay had Scheckter behind him, but Emerson in front was the real target. So Jody wasn't reading the script when he got past. but the South African ran out of brakes, so Clay motored serenely on to second and ensured that the title race would go all the way down to the wire at Watkins Glen.
And Emerson, if we could get you over this way, along with our second and third place men, Clay Regazzoni and Ronnie Peterson.
The bandit smile on the podium told you that Clay fancied his chances. He and Emerson were now precisely equal on points. Things went wrong right from the start at the Glen, and Clay would later mutter darkly that he thought that Montezuma might prefer the younger, more dynamic Lauda to win Ferrari's first driver's crown in a decade, rather than someone who was an unfashionable aging journeyman by comparison. On the grid, Clay was a visibly disappointed ninth, but Emerson was only one place in front, so the dream was still alive. And in spite of all these pressures from Italy, Rega made a good start, and certainly a much better one than his former teammate Andretti, who stalled on the grid. Clay charged ahead, fighting with Depailler for sixth, but Fittipaldi at this point was up the road and ahead. It looked like mission accomplished for Clay when he overtook Emerson for fifth place, but just a few laps later he was into the pits and into World Championship oblivion. A regretful Rega was later quoted as saying that this was his blackest day and a great disappointment because the world title would have given meaning to his whole career. By 1975, Clay was making his feelings plain to both Fugere and Montezuma, and at Monza of all places. A fairly regular stream of accidents throughout the year meant that this was by no means the first time he'd have to use the T car, the team's spare. All was then forgotten and forgiven when he helped to form an all-Ferrari front row. Clay even managed to keep his nose clean in the first corner carnage that followed, and put Tony Bryce and the Embassy into the pits and out of the race. Regazzoni leads Lauda at Monza, the Tifosi dream scenario, and even Montezuma looked pleased. Little wonder, because the result meant that Clay had won the Italian Grand Prix and Niki Lauda the 1975 World Championship. Rega wouldn't look quite so delighted again until the following year's Long Beach Grand Prix in 1976. This would turn out to be Clay's day of days, the race where the notoriously accident-prone Swiss driver turned in a faultless performance of ballet grace. For once, Lauda, now in car number 1 as reigning world champion, was left in the dust as Rega simply drove away from the rest of the field. From the freeway down the chute into the parking lot and away, Clay had this first ever Long Beach Grand Prix in his pocket. A spectating Frank Williams was soon to be in negotiation with a series of newly oil-rich Saudi Arabian sponsors would remember this particular performance for a long time to come, because this was the day that Clay kept it out of the concrete walls and won by a country mile. And when you win a Formula One Grand Prix, the world wants to be your friend. By Monza, though, Rega was once again out of favour with Il Commendatore. He failed to beat Hunt in Holland to protect the injured Lauda's World Championship lead, Enzo Ferrari's reaction was to sign Carlos Reutemann instead. Lauda's unexpected return saw the Scuderia again enter 3 cars here, and perhaps Clay's future fate was sealed when he qualified slowest out of the trio. He was behind Reutemann and even more amazingly behind Lauda, who had been given the last rites on his apparent deathbed only 6 weeks earlier. Clay kept out of trouble and passed Nicky at the notoriously tricky first chicane, prelude to an epic drive. Halfway round on the first lap and Clay was now up to 5th and very much on a charge. Just a few laps later and Clay was now 3rd, begging the question, what on earth was Enzo doing, trying to get rid of this driver for the 2nd time in 4 years? According to Niki Lauda in his first autobiography, the answer lay in Clay's own brand of genes. When Enzo Ferrari was driving to work at Modena one morning, he passed 2 young women with Ferrari prancing horses emblazoned on their jeans. The old man was furious, said Lauda. What cheek, what insolence! The fellow who sells his trousers with the Ferrari horse on the backside. Peterson, Regazzoni, Lafitte. That's the way it stayed right to the finish. And 2nd place at Monza was never going to be good enough for Enzo Ferrari now, so Clay would have to look elsewhere for a drive in 1977. Rega was still lightning fast through Lesmo, but Ronnie was always a second or so in front. The Tifosi still loved watching Regazzoni, but in 1977 and 78 they sadly saw him struggling at Monza, driving first for Ensign and then Shadow. If it had been up to Ferrari's notoriously fervent fans, Clay never would have been allowed to leave. The biggest cheer of the day, up on the victory dais, was for Rega's champagne shower. This would be Clay's Monza farewell as a Ferrari driver, despite the fact that he remained firmly the crowd's favourite.
Indubbiamente per me è una soddisfazione e un'ulteriore dimostrazione che sono sempre le regazzoni di una volta. Comunque oggi la pioggia penso che ha negato la Ferrari a me una terza vittoria.
Fast forward 2.5 years to Monaco 79 and Frank Williams has finally got Clay into one of his cars. And 1979 would prove to be a real Indian summer for Clay. A splendid 2nd spell at the sharp end of the Grand Prix grid, and during all the Formula One hullabaloo he remained as relaxed as ever. Patrick Head designed for Frank Williams just about the fastest ground effect car yet built, the elegant looking and devastatingly swift Saudia Williams FW07. The Williams team would eventually grow weary of Clay's unhurried qualifying efforts, but thrilled at his excellent race performances. Monaco was a perfect case in point. Rega lined up only 16th on the grid, but would go on to be just about the fastest man in the race. Clay's new teammate, Australian Alan Jones, qualified much nearer the front and made an excellent start. Rega, meanwhile, got stuck behind Hans Stuck's ATS in deepest midfield. Precious time was lost until Clay eventually managed to break free. Jody Schechter's Ferrari led up front, and by the final few laps, Reger had muscled his way up to second, right behind the South African. Clay finished runner-up by less than a second. Silverstone 79 capped a decade of underachievement for Frank Williams. A decade earlier, and his late friend Piers Courage had driven a Williams car to 5th place in the 1969 British Grand Prix. 10 years on, and Team Williams still hadn't won a single race. A dynamic and even edgy Frank Williams knew full well that the FW07 was a potential race winner, and Reger was always quick through the Woodcote chicane. He qualified a strong 4th. At 39 years of age, Clay Regazzoni surely knew inside his cockpit that this British Grand Prix might well offer the fleeting chance of a last Formula One win.
Ian, on the start grid, we've got Frank Williams and Jean Charles, the team managers of the two cars on the front row. What could you two possibly be talking about now, Frank?
We were actually talking about how much fuel we're carrying. Each one of us was telling a lie to the other.
Did you tell him a lie, Jean?
Yes, of course.
Okay, back to you, Ian. That's what they talk about.
Calm on the grid, Reger grew horns at the sight of the green light. Up alongside teammate Jones at the start, he amazingly took the lead into Copse Corner. Jones passed him later into Stowe, however, and Reger's role was to hold up the Renaults. His job spec then changed 2/3 of the way through the race when Alan's engine suddenly blew up. Having inherited the lead, Reger's new task was simply to keep going and secure Williams Engineering's first ever win. A naturally nervous-looking Frank could surely not have anticipated that it would be his Swiss veteran number 2 driver who would take his team's first ever checkered flag, rather than his established number 1, the burly Australian Alan Jones. But Clay kept it on the island, and Frank's relief and delight at the end were obvious. Perhaps the most unsurprised man in the whole place was Regazzoni himself. He'd ended the 1970s decade now, just as he had started it, by winning a Grand Prix. This was his 7th Formula One win in all, and perhaps the sweetest of the lot. If Clay looked subdued at Hockenheim just one race later, it was because he'd heard whispers that Williams wouldn't be retaining him for 1980. He lamented to one particular friend, "This is like 1976 all over again. I'm in a great car with a team I really like, and I think they're going to replace me with Reutemann." He thought right. Jones was on the front row, Clay qualifying only 6th, and perhaps by now hard-headed decision for the future had already been made by Team Williams. Having been lauded to the skies a fortnight previously, Clay's 5th place in the early stages made many wonder whether he was now past his best. In just a month's time, after all, he'd hit the landmark age of 40. As Jones roared ahead to his first ever Grand Prix win, Clay sped on to a decent 2nd place, the perfect teammates' result, he'd surely argue. A 1-2 then, a first ever for Williams. Further Grand Prix history had been made. Jones showed on the podium what he thought of his teammate, and Alan certainly wanted the lineup to stay exactly the same for 1980. In 1980, Clay went back to Ensign, which was undergoing a revival thanks to Unipart money. At Long Beach, Reger qualified 23rd. On lap 51, working his way up to 4th place on the fastest part of the circuit from 175 miles an hour, he started braking for the 20-mile-an-hour hairpin. The titanium brake pedal snapped at the end of the long straight and Reger crashed into a barrier. He suffered spinal injuries that resulted in paralysis below the waist. Regazzoni refused to give up and in the late 1980s began competing in hand-controlled vehicles on the Paris-Dakar Rally. He went on competing until 2000, when he took part in the London-Sydney Marathon Rally at the age of 61. Nothing could quench the racing spirit of one of Formula One's most legendary names, Clay Regazzoni. Regrettably, he died in a road accident in Italy in 2006.